For thousands of years, humanity has asked the same question: what are dreams? Civilizations once believed they were messages from the gods. Others believed they revealed the future, connected us to distant places, or allowed the soul to travel beyond the body. As science advanced, many of those ideas gave way to neuroscience. Today, we know that dreams are closely linked to sleep stages, memory, emotion, and complex patterns of brain activity. We can measure electrical signals, observe REM sleep, and identify networks that become active while we dream. Those discoveries have transformed our understanding of the sleeping brain. But despite everything we have learned, one fundamental question remains unanswered. Where does the experience itself come from? Not simply the electrical activity, not the chemistry, not the neurons, the experience. Every night, your mind creates worlds that feel completely real. You recognize faces, you walk through places, you hold conversations, you experience fear, excitement, love, confusion, and wonder. For those moments, the dream is not something you observe, it is reality. In the previous chapters of Project Oneiris, we explored what modern science understands about dreaming and consciousness. We examined the leading theories, the remarkable discoveries, and the questions that continue to challenge researchers around the world. Again and again, we arrived at the same boundary. Current science explains many of the mechanisms involved in dreaming, but explaining the mechanisms is not the same as explaining the experience. Even more importantly, explaining how the brain functions is not necessarily the same as explaining how an entire dream is constructed. Every dream contains information: scenes, people, objects, voices, stories, entire environments that appear almost instantly. The question is not whether the brain is involved. Of course it is. The deeper question is this: how does consciousness transform information into an entire lived reality? That question became the foundation of Project Oneiris. What follows is not an accepted scientific theory. It is not established neuroscience. It is not a claim, it is a hypothesis. One designed to ask a new question, make testable predictions, and invite investigation rather than belief. Like every scientific hypothesis, it succeeds only if it survives evidence. If the evidence disagrees with it, it should be revised or rejected. That is how science moves forward. So, with that understanding, we arrive at the central proposal of this project. The Oneiris hypothesis begins with a simple observation. Dreams may not require consciousness to generate every detail from nothing. Instead, consciousness may reconstruct complete dream experiences from surprisingly limited informational prompts. If that idea is correct, it changes the question entirely. Not how does the brain create a dream, but how much information is actually needed to create an entire reality. That is where our investigation begins. Every dream you've ever experienced has one thing in common. It contains information. Not just random flashes of light or disconnected thoughts. Information. A face you've never consciously noticed. A city that has never existed. A conversation that feels completely natural. A lifetime compressed into a few moments. A world that appears complete the instant you arrive. This raises an important question. How much information is actually required to create an experience? Imagine walking into a movie theater. For 2 hours you laugh, worry, feel suspense, celebrate victories, and mourn losses. When the credits roll, it feels as though you have lived through an entire story. Yet that experience did not require you to personally create every image. It began with a script. From those written pages came actors, sets, music, lighting, dialogue, visual effects, and emotion. The final experience became vastly larger than the information that first described it. Dreams may operate in a surprisingly similar way. Perhaps consciousness does not invent every detail independently. Perhaps it receives a relatively small amount of information and expands it into a complete lived reality. Think about how quickly dreams begin. One moment there is darkness. The next, you already know where you are. You understand the setting. You recognize people. You accept the rules of that world without question. Rarely does the dream build itself piece by piece. Instead, the experience often feels complete from the very first instant. That observation leads to a different way of thinking. Maybe the brain is not generating every detail one by one in real time. Maybe consciousness is exceptionally efficient at reconstructing entire experiences from remarkably limited informational inputs. In everyday life, we see this kind of reconstruction everywhere. A few musical notes become a melody. A handful of letters become an entire language. A few lines of computer code create complex virtual worlds. A tiny strand of DNA contains the instructions for building an entire human body. Again and again, nature demonstrates that extraordinary complexity can emerge from surprisingly compact information. Could dreams represent another example of that same principle? If so, the brain would not need to encode every leaf on every tree, every grain of sand, or every expression on every face before the dream begins. Instead, consciousness could dynamically construct those details as they become relevant to the experience itself. This idea forms the foundation of the Oneiris hypothesis. Not that dreams are random, not that dreams are predetermined, but that conscious experience may be built through a process of reconstruction rather than exhaustive generation. If that is true, another question immediately follows. If consciousness reconstructs dream realities from informational prompts, what exactly are those prompts, and where do they come from? That is the next step in our investigation. If consciousness is capable of reconstructing an entire dream from remarkably limited information, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is an informational prompt? The Oneiris hypothesis proposes that an informational prompt is not a complete dream. It is not a finished story. It is not a fully formed memory. Instead, it is the minimum amount of information necessary to begin constructing a conscious experience. Think of a single word. By itself, the word contains very little information. Yet if I say, ocean, your mind immediately begins creating far more than the word itself. Perhaps you imagine waves crashing against the shore, the smell of salt in the air, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of seabirds overhead, or memories from your own life. None of those details were contained within the word itself. They were constructed by your own mind. The informational prompt simply initiated the process. Now imagine that principle operating on a far greater scale. Instead of one word, imagine an informational prompt containing just enough structure to initiate an entire dream. Consciousness could then build the environment, the people, the emotions, the dialogue, the sequence of events, moment by moment, not because every detail was predetermined, but because consciousness continuously reconstructs the experience as it unfolds. This idea may seem unfamiliar, yet reconstruction is something the brain already performs throughout everyday life. Memory is not believed to function as a perfect recording. When we remember an event, the brain actively reconstructs that memory using stored information, context, expectations, and associations. Perception works in a similar way. Your brain does not simply copy reality. It combines incoming sensory information with prior knowledge, expectations, and predictions to create the experience you perceive. The Oneiris hypothesis asks whether dreaming could represent another form of reconstruction. Not reconstruction from external sensory information, but reconstruction from internally available informational prompts. Notice what this hypothesis does not claim. It does not claim that neuroscience is wrong. It does not reject predictive processing. It does not reject memory consolidation. It does not reject emotional processing. Those processes may all contribute to dreaming. Instead, the hypothesis proposes that they may provide the raw informational ingredients from which consciousness reconstructs an entire dream experience. In other words, the question is no longer, how does the brain create every detail? The question becomes, how little information does consciousness actually need before it can construct a complete reality? That distinction may appear subtle, but it changes the direction of the investigation. Rather than searching for every individual component of a dream, we begin asking how conscious experience itself transforms information into reality. At this stage, one important question still remains unanswered. Even if dreams are reconstructed from informational prompts, where do those prompts originate? Project Oneiris is not prepared to answer that question. Not yet. Because before we investigate the possible sources of those informational prompts, we must first ask something even more important. If this hypothesis is true, what evidence should we expect to find? That is where our investigation continues. Predictions of the Oneiris hypothesis. A scientific hypothesis is valuable only if it can be tested. If there is no possible observation that could support it or contradict it, then it remains speculation rather than science. The Oneiris hypothesis is no different. If consciousness truly reconstructs dream experiences from limited informational prompts, then this model should lead to predictions that future research could investigate. These are not claims that the hypothesis has already been proven. They are expectations that naturally follow if the model is correct. The first prediction concerns efficiency. Rather than storing or generating every detail of a dream simultaneously, consciousness would be expected to construct details dynamically, revealing information only as the experience requires it. In other words, dream environments may be assembled in real time rather than existing as fully rendered worlds from the very beginning. This is similar to how many modern computer systems conserve resources by generating or loading information only when it becomes necessary. The comparison is only an analogy, not evidence, but it illustrates how complex experiences can emerge without every detail existing all at once. The second prediction concerns consistency. If dreams are reconstructed from informational prompts, then similar prompts should tend to produce recognizable patterns or themes across different dreams, even though the final experiences may differ from person to person. The prompt may remain similar. The reconstruction may be unique. The third prediction concerns flexibility. Small differences in informational input could potentially lead to dramatically different dream experiences. A subtle change in the initial conditions might redirect an entire dream narrative, much as a single sentence can change the direction of an entire conversation. The fourth prediction involves reconstruction itself. If consciousness is actively building the dream as it unfolds, then gaps, inconsistencies, or sudden transitions within dreams may not simply represent errors. They may reflect moments where the reconstruction process changes direction, incorporates new information, or adapts to evolving internal conditions. This possibility could help explain why dreams often shift seamlessly from one scene to another without the dreamer recognizing anything unusual until waking. Finally, the Oneiris hypothesis predicts something even broader. If conscious experience is fundamentally reconstructive during dreaming, researchers may eventually discover similar reconstruction principles operating in other states of consciousness as well. Whether during imagination, memory, perception, or dreams, the underlying process may prove to be variations of the same fundamental mechanism. That possibility remains entirely open. Just as important as predictions are opportunities for failure. A hypothesis gains strength only by risking being wrong. If future evidence demonstrates that dream experiences require fully specified neural representations before conscious awareness begins, if reconstruction from limited informational prompts proves impossible, or if a better model consistently explains dream formation with greater accuracy and predictive power, then the Oneiris hypothesis should be revised or abandoned. That is not a weakness. It is the foundation of science. Scientific progress is not measured by defending ideas at all costs. It is measured by allowing evidence to determine which ideas survive. At this point, the Oneiris hypothesis has proposed a possible mechanism. It has offered predictions. It has accepted the possibility of being wrong. But one profound mystery still remains. Even if consciousness reconstructs dreams from informational prompts, where do those informational prompts originate? Could they arise entirely from known brain processes? Or is there another layer of explanation still waiting to be discovered? That question takes us beyond the reconstruction model itself and toward the most speculative and potentially most controversial chapter of Project Oneiris. That investigation begins next. Questions, criticisms, and the road ahead. Every new scientific hypothesis begins with questions. The Oneiris hypothesis is no exception. If you follow this journey from the beginning, you may already have objections forming in your mind. That is exactly what should happen. Science advances through careful skepticism, not unquestioning acceptance. One of the first questions is whether this hypothesis is even necessary. Modern neuroscience already offers several explanations for dreaming. Dreams have been linked to memory consolidation, emotional processing, predictive processing, creativity, learning, and spontaneous patterns of brain activity during sleep. Perhaps these mechanisms are already sufficient. Perhaps no additional explanatory framework is needed. That possibility must remain on the table. Another important question concerns the informational prompts themselves. Could they simply be fragments of memory? Could they emerge from the brain's own predictive models? Could they arise from associations built over an entire lifetime of experience? If so, the Oneiris hypothesis may simply provide a new way of describing existing cognitive processes rather than introducing an entirely new mechanism. That too would be a valuable outcome. Scientific progress is not always about discovering something completely new. Sometimes it comes from recognizing a deeper pattern connecting ideas that already exist. Another challenge concerns measurement. At present, we cannot directly observe the complete informational structure that gives rise to a dream. We can study neural activity, we can record sleep stages, we can compare dream reports after awakening, but the subjective experience itself remains difficult to measure with precision. This limits every current theory of dreaming, not just the Oneiris hypothesis. As technology advances, future methods may allow researchers to investigate dream formation with far greater detail than is possible today. Another criticism is philosophical. Some may argue that consciousness itself is too poorly understood to support any model of dream reconstruction. That is a reasonable concern. If consciousness remains one of science's greatest mysteries, then any hypothesis involving conscious experience must be presented with humility. Project Oneiris does not claim to solve consciousness. It begins with the recognition that consciousness is still an open scientific problem. Perhaps the most important question is this: what evidence would change our minds? If future research consistently demonstrates that dreams are fully explained through established mechanisms with no need for a reconstruction model based on informational prompts, then the Oneiris hypothesis should be revised or set aside. That is not failure. It is the scientific process working exactly as it should. The goal of Project Oneiris has never been to defend an idea at all costs. Its purpose is to ask better questions, to identify gaps in our understanding, and to encourage investigations that can move the science of dreaming forward. With that foundation in place, one final question remains. Even if dreams are reconstructed from limited informational prompts, what is the ultimate origin of those prompts? Are they generated entirely by known brain processes? Do they emerge from mechanisms we have not yet discovered? Or could there be possibilities that modern science has only begun to explore? Those questions take us beyond the reconstruction hypothesis itself. They lead into territory where neuroscience, physics, and philosophy begin to intersect. Some of those ideas are highly speculative. Some may ultimately prove to be incorrect. But they are worth examining carefully, provided we remain clear about the difference between evidence, inference, and imagination. That is where Project Oneiris goes next. A new framework for asking better questions. Throughout this journey, we have not attempted to prove a new theory of dreams. Instead, we have asked a different question. Could there be another way to understand how dream experiences are constructed? The Oneiris hypothesis does not reject neuroscience. It does not reject psychology. It does not reject the remarkable discoveries made through decades of sleep research. On the contrary, it depends upon them. Without everything science has already uncovered about sleep, memory, perception, and consciousness, this hypothesis could not even be proposed. Science is cumulative. Every discovery builds upon those that came before it. The purpose of the Oneiris hypothesis is not to replace existing knowledge. It is to ask whether another layer of explanation may exist, one that focuses not only on the biological mechanisms of dreaming, but on the informational structure from which conscious experience emerges. At its heart, the hypothesis is remarkably simple. Dreams may not require consciousness to create every detail from nothing. Instead, consciousness may reconstruct complete experiential worlds from surprisingly limited informational prompts. Whether that idea ultimately proves correct remains unknown. What matters is whether it can be investigated, whether it can generate predictions, whether experiments can challenge it, whether evidence supports it or refutes it. Those are the standards every scientific hypothesis must meet. History reminds us that progress rarely comes from asking familiar questions in familiar ways. Theories evolve, models improve. Some ideas become stronger through evidence. Others are discarded when they fail. That willingness to revise our understanding is one of science's greatest strengths. If the Oneiris hypothesis is incomplete, future research should improve it. If it is fundamentally flawed, future evidence should reveal why. And if parts of it prove useful, they should be incorporated into better models that continue expanding our understanding of the mind. That is not failure. That is exactly how scientific knowledge advances. But every meaningful investigation eventually reaches a new question. For Project Oneiris, that question has been waiting since the very beginning. If consciousness reconstructs dream experiences from informational prompts, where do those prompts originate? Are they entirely generated by processes already understood within the brain? Do they emerge from interactions we have not yet identified? Or is our current understanding of information itself still incomplete? These questions do not have established answers. Any attempt to answer them moves beyond accepted science into the realm of scientific speculation. That distinction is essential. A hypothesis should never be mistaken for evidence. Possibility should never be confused with proof. As we continue this investigation, those principles will remain unchanged. We will separate established science from informed speculation. We will distinguish evidence from interpretation, and we will allow every idea, including the Oneiris hypothesis itself, to stand or fall on the strength of future evidence. Because Project Oneiris is not about defending a conclusion. It is about following the evidence wherever it leads. Our next chapter begins where this one ends. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Not with answers, but with a question. If informational prompts exist, what is their source? That is the investigation ahead. Thank you for joining me on Part 4 of Project Oneiris. If this exploration challenged the way you think about dreams, consciousness, or the scientific process itself, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. Thoughtful disagreement is just as valuable as agreement when it's grounded in evidence and curiosity. If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing to LTL Entertainment so you don't miss Part 5, where we'll begin exploring possible origins of dream information. From established neuroscience to more speculative ideas at the intersection of physics and consciousness, always making clear where evidence ends and hypothesis begins. Until next time, keep asking questions.